You had every word ready, fully formed and waiting there in your mind, right on the tip of your tongue the entire time it was happening. Every single sentence lined up in your mind in order, sharp enough to cut deeply if you'd let it out, accurate enough to genuinely sting the moment it landed, justified enough given everything that had already happened that nobody watching or listening could have reasonably blamed you for saying any of it out loud in that exact moment, right then and there. And you didn't say a single one of them, not one word, even though every part of you had the ammunition fully loaded and ready to fire. That choice, made in real time under real genuine pressure, has quietly earned you far more respect from the people who witnessed it than the most articulate, cutting argument ever could have. There's a common, deeply held assumption in most people's minds that winning a conflict means having the actual last word, landing the sharpest, most memorable line at exactly the right moment in the exchange, walking away having clearly and unmistakably proven your point to everyone watching or listening in the room. That assumption is usually wrong, more often than most people realize, until they've actually lived through a moment quite like this one themselves and seen firsthand how it actually plays out. What people actually remember afterward, once the initial heat of the moment has faded, isn't who said the most cutting thing in the room that day. It's who stayed steady while everyone else lost their footing entirely, who didn't need to prove anything at all because their composure had already said everything that genuinely needed saying. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. It genuinely helps this reach more people who could use hearing it right now, today. If you're back again, welcome back. Glad to have you here. Take what applies to your specific situation and skip whatever doesn't feel relevant to what you're actually dealing with. Silence in that specific moment wasn't the absence of a response at all, even though it might have looked that way to anyone watching casually from the outside. It was the response, chosen deliberately in real time, under conditions that made choosing anything at all genuinely difficult. Choosing not to escalate, not to match volume with volume the way instinct probably urged you to, not to hand someone the exact reaction they were clearly hoping to provoke out of you, takes a kind of discipline that looks passive from the outside but is anything but passive on the inside, where the actual work was actually happening the whole time. You made a real decision in real time, under real pressure, and the decision you made was restraint. People genuinely underestimate how much real effort it actually takes to stay quiet when staying quiet is by far the harder, more demanding option available to you in that specific moment. Speaking up in anger is often the easier path to take by comparison, the one that requires considerably less internal management and self-control, because it simply lets whatever's building up inside come out unfiltered, immediately, without any real friction slowing it down or holding it back in any way. Choosing silence instead means holding all of that back deliberately, consciously, on purpose, while still being fully present and engaged in the moment it's actually happening, not checked out or numb to it. That's not weakness in any sense of the word. That's considerable, genuine strength, exercised quietly enough and privately enough that it rarely gets credited as strength at all by anyone watching from a distance. Everyone in that room, or on that phone call, or in that particular conversation, whatever specific setting it actually took place in that day, was watching closely to see exactly what you'd do next, whether they ever said so out loud to you directly afterward or not. And what you actually did was refuse, firmly and deliberately, to give the situation the fuel it was clearly, obviously asking for the entire time it was unfolding. That refusal registered with the people present, even if absolutely nobody mentioned it afterward or brought it up again in any conversation you were part of. It told them something genuinely true about your character, that a sharp, satisfying comeback, however tempting and justified it might have felt in the moment, never could have communicated nearly as clearly or as convincingly. An argument, even a genuinely well-constructed and perfectly reasonable one, invites more argument in return from the other side, almost without exception, no matter how carefully or fairly it was originally delivered. It escalates the tension further, instead of resolving it in any meaningful, lasting way. It gives the other person something concrete and tangible to push against, something to twist and misrepresent later on when the story gets retold. Something to use afterward as convenient evidence that you're just as difficult, just as reactive, just as much a part of the underlying problem as they clearly are. Silence doesn't give them any of that ammunition to work with. It leaves the entire weight of what actually happened resting squarely on their side of the room, with absolutely nothing for them to point back at, except their own behavior in that moment, unobscured by anything you said or did in response. The people who witnessed that specific moment firsthand are almost certainly still thinking about it in some way, even right now, even if the actual conversation itself has long since moved on to entirely different, unrelated things in the time that's passed since then. Moments where someone chose genuine restraint under real, sustained pressure tend to stick clearly in memory for far longer than moments of ordinary conflict that simply played out exactly the way everyone in the room already expected them to unfold based on past patterns. You did something genuinely unexpected in that moment. You didn't take the obvious bait that was clearly being dangled in front of you, and that specific, unexpected choice is precisely what made the whole moment memorable to the people who saw it happen. There's a real difference between staying silent because you genuinely have nothing at all to say, and staying silent because you actually have plenty to say and are consciously, deliberately choosing not to say any of it out loud in that particular moment. People can usually sense which one they're actually witnessing in real time, even without ever being told directly which specific kind it truly was. The silence that comes from real restraint carries a completely different weight and texture than the silence that comes from simply having nothing left to give in a given moment. Yours was almost certainly the first kind, the deliberate kind, and that specific distinction is exactly what earned the quiet respect it did, quiet as that respect remained. Your silence also protected something genuinely real that a sharp, satisfying response in that moment would have put directly at risk, whether that was a relationship you actually deeply value, a professional reputation you've spent years working hard to build, or simply your own private sense of who you actually want to be when things get genuinely difficult and testing. Words spoken in anger are notoriously famously hard to take back once they're actually out in the room and can't be unsaid, no matter how much you might wish you could retrieve them afterward. Silence leaves the door genuinely open, in a way a spoken argument never can. It doesn't foreclose anything the way an argument, once actually spoken aloud, permanently and irreversibly does. Some people will interpret silence as weakness, at least initially, in the exact moment it's actually happening in real time, especially people who are already used to conflict escalating in the specific way they've personally come to expect it to unfold, based on their own past experience with similar situations. That particular interpretation rarely survives contact with actual time and honest reflection afterward. Weeks or months later, once the immediate dust has fully settled and everyone involved has had a genuine chance to reflect honestly on what actually happened, the person who stayed genuinely quiet under real pressure tends to be remembered as the one who actually held it together with real composure, while the memory of anyone who escalated tends to age considerably worse, growing less flattering rather than more as time passes. You don't actually need anyone at all to specifically tell you, out loud in plain words, that your silence was the right call to make in that moment for it to have genuinely actually been the right call all along, regardless of any spoken acknowledgement. A lot of genuinely wise choices go completely unacknowledged in the moment they're actually made, sometimes for a considerably long time afterward, months or even years, simply because openly acknowledging them would require someone else present to honestly admit that the alternative, the louder, sharper reaction they might have secretly expected or even quietly wanted from you in that moment, wouldn't have actually served you or the overall situation any better in the end. This doesn't mean silence is always the correct, appropriate answer in every single situation you'll ever encounter going forward in your life, in every relationship or workplace conflict you'll ever face. There are genuine times when speaking up directly, clearly, and firmly is exactly what a specific moment actually and legitimately calls for, and choosing silence in those particular situations instead would be a form of quiet avoidance rather than genuine, deliberate restraint, a way of dodging something you actually needed to confront and address head-on, directly, without hiding behind composure as an excuse. But in the particular situation you're thinking of right now, the one that specifically prompted you to click on this video in the first place, your instinct to hold back was almost certainly the wiser, more accurate read of the room, even if it didn't feel that way at all while you were actually living through it in real time. There's a specific kind of clarity that comes afterward, only once enough real time has actually passed to look back honestly and clearly at what actually happened in that moment. Replaying the whole scene now in your mind, you can probably see clearly, with the benefit of hindsight, exactly what would have happened if you'd said everything you were holding back internally in that instant of pure tension. The conversation would have shifted entirely away from whatever the actual underlying issue was and toward your specific reaction instead, giving the other person exactly what they needed to reframe the entire situation as being fundamentally about your temper rather than about whatever they'd actually done to cause it in the first place. Silence denied them that reframe completely, and that denial, quiet as it was, is its own form of holding ground. It's worth naming, too, that choosing silence in a moment exactly like that one doesn't mean the underlying issue itself goes unaddressed forever, indefinitely, without any real resolution ever taking place down the line. There's a real, meaningful difference between staying silent in the heated moment itself and staying silent about the underlying issue permanently, never bringing it up again in any form or context for the rest of the relationship. You're allowed to have held your tongue in the room that specific day and still address what actually happened later on, calmly, on your own terms and in your own time, once emotions on all sides have genuinely settled enough for an actual, productive conversation to take place rather than another combative exchange. Consider, too, how this specific choice you made reflects something you'll likely draw on again in future situations you'll face down the line, not just this one isolated incident that happened to prompt this video. Restraint under real pressure is a genuine skill that compounds steadily with practice over time, becoming somewhat easier and more automatic each and every time you exercise it successfully in a difficult moment. The version of you who held back in that particular moment is quietly building a track record with yourself, tangible evidence you can point back to the next time a difficult situation tempts you toward a reaction you'd likely come to regret afterward. That evidence matters more, ultimately, than any external validation from other people ever could, because it's the kind of proof that stays genuinely with you regardless of whether anyone else ever witnesses it firsthand or comments on it directly. There's something worth naming about how this specific moment of restraint may have quietly recalibrated how people around you approach conflict with you going forward from here, even if none of them have consciously connected that particular shift back to this exact incident that started it. Once someone has witnessed you hold steady under real, genuine provocation like that, they tend to adjust their own expectations accordingly going forward, almost without realizing they're doing it consciously, becoming somewhat more careful about how they approach you in future disagreements down the line, because they've now seen firsthand, with their own eyes, that provoking you doesn't actually work the way it might work reliably with someone else who reacts predictably and loudly every time. That gradual shift in how people engage with you afterward is one of the quieter, longer-lasting effects of a single moment of restraint, one that plays out slowly over months rather than being visible or obvious immediately in the aftermath. It's worth thinking, too, about what this particular moment actually revealed to you about your own personal values, separate entirely from how anyone else in the room happened to perceive it or react to it at the time. Somewhere underneath the immediate impulse to respond sharply and get everything off your chest right then and there was a competing value quietly at work in the background, something you cared about more in that exact instant than being right or being heard immediately by everyone present. Maybe it was the relationship itself, something you weren't willing to risk over a single heated moment. Maybe it was your own sense of dignity, the kind that doesn't require matching someone else's poor behavior to feel genuinely intact. Maybe it was simply not wanting to become, even briefly, even for one single conversation, the kind of person who says things they can't ever fully take back afterward, no matter how satisfying it might have felt in that exact instant. Whatever it was, that value won out in a genuinely difficult moment, and that outcome tells you something real and specific about your own priorities that's worth holding on to. There's also a particular kind of respect that comes specifically from people who've been on the other side of a moment exactly like this one themselves, who know firsthand, from direct personal experience, exactly how hard it genuinely is to hold silence when everything in you is actively pushing towards speaking up loudly instead. If anyone who witnessed what you did has ever faced a similar test themselves at some point earlier in their own life and failed it in that specific moment, spoken words in the heat of things they later deeply regretted saying, escalated a situation they later wished they'd simply let sit quietly instead, their respect for what you managed to do carries an extra layer of genuine weight and understanding that goes beyond simple admiration. They're not admiring restraint in some abstract, purely theoretical way, the kind you read about but never actually witnessed firsthand. They're admiring something they know from direct lived experience is genuinely difficult to actually pull off successfully in the exact moment it matters most. Silence in a moment exactly like that one also communicates a genuine kind of quiet confidence that an argument, however well constructed and carefully reasoned, rarely manages to convey nearly as clearly or as convincingly. Someone who feels the constant need to win every single exchange, to have the last word every single time without a single exception, is often signaling, whether they consciously intend to or not, a real degree of underlying insecurity about whether their position actually holds up on its own without constant, repeated defending. Choosing not to engage at all sends a quieter but considerably more powerful message than any spoken words could have, that your sense of who you genuinely are doesn't depend on winning that particular moment, that particular argument, or convincing that particular person of anything at all. There's one more thing worth naming before wrapping this up, something that ties all of this together clearly. The specific person or people who provoked that reaction in you almost certainly wanted a version of you that matched their own energy exactly, that gave them a convenient reason to feel justified in whatever they'd already said or done leading up to that particular moment. By staying silent, you denied them that specific justification entirely. You didn't give them anything to point back to later and say, "See, this is exactly what I was dealing with the whole time." Instead, you left them alone with only their own behavior to account for, unobscured by anything you said or did in response to it.